Hey guys, in this video I'm gonna give you 5 bishop rules that every player should know. And the first rule includes our bishop and our own pawns. And it says, assess your bishop strength based on your pawn structure. So in general, you want to remember that we don't want to block our bishop with our own pawns. Let's take a look at this example. Here we don't want to play pawn to e3 because after that the bishop is closed and cannot play actively, so we don't do that. Most of the time people play bishop f4 because after we play e3 next, this bishop plays actively on this diagonal. The bishop is outside of the pawn chain. In another example, we play as black, and this time we don't want to play pawn to e6 because it blocks our light square bishop, and the bishop cannot play actively now or in the near future. So instead of e6, we start first with bishop f5 or bishop g4, and then we can play pawn to e6. Okay, I think this concept is understandable, so let's move on to exceptions. In Queen's Gambit, after d4, d5, pawn to c4, black can easily play pawn to e6, closing the bishop. So where's the difference? And actually the difference is here with this pawn on c4, because it means that there is some action on the queen side, which will allow our light square bishop to find a good place on the board later on in the game. Let's consider here 3 scenarios. The first one is white captures the pawn on d5, we recapture, and now we can see that the diagonal is open for our bishop, so we can develop the bishop easily. The second example is white decides to not take the pawn and continue development. He plays knight c3, we play knight f6. By the way, this pawn seems to be hanging on c4. By taking it right away leads to some complicated variations that I want to skip for today. So we play knight f6, they play knight f3, we develop the bishop, they develop the bishop, castling e3, and at some point we will just take the pawn on c4 and then play b6, bringing this bishop to the long diagonal. And the third scenario is your opponents play pawn to c5. So then we can play b6 right away, they capture, we take towards the center, and we got lead in development as our rook is already opened. Okay, but in this situation where there is no pawn on c4, white decided to go bishop f4, we need to remember that pawn to e6 closes our bishop, and there is no guarantee that we will find a good place for this bishop in the near future. And another exception, white has a lead in development, has more pieces on the board, and we always try to prioritize castling, but in this scenario we definitely have to do that. We cannot keep our king longer in the middle, so we want to play pawn to e6, next develop our dark square bishop, and basically castle. What happens if we decide to not castle and bring the bishop out first? Bishop g4, for example, he plays knight e5, we take the queen, and then we lost the game. Or for example, you can do another mistake by playing bishop f5, then the opponent attacks our pawn on f7, so we block it, and then g4 attacking the bishop, we go back h4, and trust me, this is a big advantage for white, even though his king is exposed at the moment. Okay, we move on to the second rule, which includes our bishop and our pieces. And the second rule says you can place bishops behind your own pieces. So if we have this type of position, people often play bishop c4 because bishop is active on this diagonal. Or in this type of position, people play bishop f4, again bishop is opened, play actively. This is completely fine. in this scenario, we have multiple squares for our dark square bishop. We can develop it to e3, f4, g5, b2, and all these squares have the same value, or like very similar, but I prefer playing bishop b2. And even though we placed the bishop behind two pieces, first of all, we've created very strong battery, and the second thing is what we want to remember, that while changing the pawn structure in chess might be very difficult sometimes, pieces move very fast. So there is no problem with placing bishop on b2. And let's take a look at another example. So the question is, which square would you choose to develop the light square bishop? We have four options, and let's discuss all of them. So bishop b5, the bishop is hanging on the opponent's territory, and placed actively only on this diagonal, in my opinion, doesn't do too much on the second diagonal, so I wouldn't play it. Bishop c4, it walks into d5, black gets the center with tempo, because we have to move our bishop again. And the third move, bishop d3, looks like a good move, and same with bishop e2, because bishop plays actively on both diagonals. The third rule includes our bishop and opponent's bishop, and it says trade your weak bishop for the opponent's strong bishop. Let's take a look at the example. So here we can see that we have the central pawn on dark square. It means that it might stop activity of our dark square bishop. In some variations, if we place our bishop on b2, it can block our bishop, or e3, this pawn can block our bishop. So we would say that this bishop will be a bit weaker, but this bishop will be more active thanks to this central pawn, because it can play actively on both diagonals here. And if we look at the position from the opponent's perspective, he has the pawn on light square. It means that this bishop could be a bit weaker, yes, because might be blocked by the central pawn, and this bishop should be better as it can play actively on these diagonals. All right, good bishop, weaker bishop. So we can think about trading them. And instead of playing classical knight f3 in this type of position and then castle, actually we can do something different and place our knight on e2. After that, the opponent plays knight f6, we start with castling, and then we might play bishop f4, offering him bishop's trade. Let's take a look at another example. So actually here we are in the middle game already, but this example I think illustrates very well the concept. So the pawns are on light squares. It means that this bishop will be strong, and one of these middle game ideas in this position will be retreating our bishop to g3 and trying trade them. Play bishop h4, for example, opponent plays, I don't know, h6, bishop g3, boom, and we will trade bishops. Let's move on to another example. Actually, this will be, it's time for exception. We can see that we have the pawn chain on light squares. So it means that this bishop should be active, right, better. And the opponent has pawn chain on dark squares, it means that this bishop should be weaker. But because this bishop is outside of the pawn chain, and it's also on the open diagonal, this bishop is not so bad. So playing bishop d6, in this case, offering trading bishops, would not be a mistake. Okay, the next rule includes our bishop and opponent's knight. And it says bishops play a little better than knights in open positions. So let's take a look here. If this knight wants to get closer to our position, it's well restricted by our bishop. And in addition, our bishop attack more squares. And that's why we prefer bishops in open positions. Now let's take a look at this example. Our bishop is under attack. Most of the time I can see that people play bishop b3 because they like to keep the bishop on the same diagonal with the king, which is of course correct idea. But I also like playing bishop e2 right now because bishop plays effectively against opponent's knight, and in addition we control both diagonals at the moment. In general, both bishop b3 and bishop e2 are correct moves. Here we have a question: should we capture the knight on c6? And I would not recommend taking this knight right away, because if we do that, we traded bishop for the knight in open position, which should be not favorable for us. And what we got in compensation, we just traded, doubled opponent's pawns, and in my opinion this is not enough compensation for that. So we castle, and then after opponent plays pawn to a6, now we can start considering taking on c6, because we double his pawns and we also get extra tempo. Yes, the opponent played a6 in this situation, but moving bishop back is also a good move, and probably this is something what I would choose. And let's take a look at another example. So remember to always predict opponent's threats, because if you decide to continue development connecting the rooks and you play, for example, queen d2, the opponent might play knight g4, and now the bishop is stuck, cannot escape. It means that this trade is forced. Yes, the opponent will trade his knight for our bishop in open position, which is favorable for your opponent. So always be careful, predict opponent's threats, a super important topic. Maybe before we move on to the third rule, please remember to subscribe to my channel. It motivates me a lot for creating more content that can help you improve the game. Alright, let's jump to the fifth rule. It includes our bishop and opponent's pawn structure and opponent's pawns. And it says pay close attention to the opponent's pawn chain. So here we can see that our dark square bishop plays extremely well on this diagonal. All these squares are opened, so this is really good position for our bishop. Let's take a look at another example. Here our bishop is also very active because the squares are not opened, but we attack both opponent's pieces, the knight and the rook behind, and there is also the pawn that we can target on the queen side. So our bishop is really active on this diagonal. And the last example, here you probably don't want to play pawn to g3 and then place the bishop on g2, because this pawn chain plays really effectively against your bishop. Yes, so placing the bishop on g2 probably will be not the best strategy. If you see the pawn chain like that, don't try to place the bishop on the same diagonal. So in this case, if we have this structure, probably it will be better to first move the dark square bishop, pawn to e3, and then develop this bishop to e2 or d3, followed by castling. Thanks for watching this video, and I strongly encourage you to watch my episode about the chess mindset, because this is the most important aspect in order to achieve like long-term success in chess. So don't make a mistake and don't skip this topic. Check out my episode about the chess mindset, and see you next time.